but let's talk about the book.
Mhm.
Half the book's about what's wrong with California, half the book's about how to fix California.
Yes.
Who's at fault for what's wrong? And again, title, Califailure, Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State. It's available in bookstores now, or if you buy your books online, unlike Steve, you could read a book on your phone. You can buy it now. Who's at fault besides the Democrats for what's wrong with California? Who else would you put on the list?
Well, I think it's before we get into individuals or parties, I think
Yeah.
the thing that's at fault is that you've had really bad ideas implemented without restraint in an environment of one party rule, which is just not healthy, and therefore there's been no real pressure to moderate or anything. So I think that's the concept. In terms of the story of how we got to that situation, I do begin the story with Reagan, with Ronald Reagan, who when he was in his first term as governor, was the first to grant collective bargaining rights to government unions in California. Now, at the time, it was, there was you could say it was a positive motivation. He wanted to support the police and firefighters and so on. But as the years went by, those collective bargaining rights were extended, Jerry Brown in particular, to all state employees and then all local government employees, to the point where you had this incredibly powerful block of government unions, incredibly well funded. And then, of course, they fund the Democrat politicians, and you get this lock now. And I'll give you one story that illustrates this. And then I want to answer. There's a couple of other answers to your question, but just on the unions, and people may say, "Oh, what's the big deal? Unions, Republicans always go on about government unions." My first real foray into California policymaking was a few years ago, when I'm looking at the biggest issues facing the state, and that really the underlying one is the housing crisis. It's the number one reason people are leaving California. Everything, it's the biggest component of most people's living expenses. It's just a nightmare. So I talked to lots of people, did a lot of policy research, and I don't want to get into the whole policy, but the headline was I was working on a ballot initiative to address two things: the taxes that governments levy on housing in California. They call it impact fees. The median impact fee for a housing unit in California today is $150,000 per housing unit. That's straight on the price. But the other big one, I mean, people talk about the environment, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. It's not so much the act itself, it's the litigation that goes with it. 70% of environmental lawsuits are used to block housing. Most of those lawsuits are filed by unions. And so the ballot initiative was to remove the private right of action under CEQA. So you just add a stroke, eliminate that problem. And right now you have over 1 million housing units in California that are blocked by this kind of litigation. So it's a huge factor. I was trying to get support for this idea. I go to Sacramento. I'm talking to Democrats because they run the place. And I'm in the office of a Democrat legislator who is known to be really good on the housing issue. Lay out the argument. They say, "You're totally right. Completely agree. This would be the biggest change we could make that would solve the problem." And I said, "Great. So let's work on it together. Will you support it? We can do this bipartisan. Fantastic." And they said, "No, I just can't." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, the unions will hate it." I said, "I know, but I hear that all the time, but why not just take them on?" I'll never forget what happened. We were just sitting in an office overlooking the state capitol, and just with they wave their arm like this. "Well, they run this place." So that's a legislator, an elected representative saying that. It's really true in California. So you got the union problem, which was initiated by Reagan.
Why would the unions not want that housing to be built?
Because they file the lawsuits in order to get leverage over house builders, to get project labor agreements where they get rules put in place like skilled and trained, which means you can only employ union members.
Is it the government unions that are blocking it, or
No,
the
those
private
private
sector?
sector unions.
Okay.
So
Sorry, I
but
misunderstood.
but also when you look at the teacher, the role of, well, if you look at the budget and the fact that, the budget of the state of California has nearly doubled in the last 10 years, everything seems to be worse. The population's falling. So much of that is going to pensions and luxury healthcare for the unions. And so we have the fiscal crisis. That's one big part of it. But the other is the actual dominant, the supermajority in the legislature, which again is does not reflect the political composition of California. If you look at elections in California since the last time Republicans won, which was Schwarzenegger's re-election in 2006, I actually did the calculation. The average share of the vote for Republican statewide candidates in that 20-year period is 41.7%. And even in a bad year where you have a weak candidate that's not well funded, you regularly get over 40%. Call it 40% Republican support. In the legislature, the proportion held by Republicans is closer to 20%. And that's the direct result of gerrymandering that happened after the 2008 ballot initiative that was supposed to introduce independent redistricting, but then ended up being hijacked to draw up districts that favored Democrats. And so you've got this entrenched one-party rule. And so it's not just the fact that it's Democrats, it's the fact that you've had completely unrestrained ability for the Democrats to introduce policies that please the core powers in the party, which is the unions and the far left activists. And that's who the politicians pay attention to. So the dynamic you've seen is the legislature introducing increasingly far left and ideologically driven legislation, and the governors, both of whom I would say Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, are not particularly far left. I wouldn't characterize them as such. Jerry Brown fought it back a little bit, Gavin Newsom not at all. And so it's really been driven out of the legislature. And then you've had this metastasizing government bloat with all the endless, the amount of legislation that they produce. I mean, this year, just now, right? The leaders of the Assembly and the Senate, both Democrats, said, we're going to put a limit on the number of bills that legislators can introduce. And they've implemented that limit. Already this year, we've had over 2,200 bills. It's just insane. Just the sheer bloat of the government. And no one's standing up to it. And so that's where you come to the word muscular, to your point earlier. We've got to challenge this because, and now I'd want to bring it into what Ezra Klein's been arguing with his abundance book, which I agree with nearly all of it. In fact, if you look at the policy papers that we've been publishing at my policy organization, Golden Together, I mean, they're literally called energy abundance, water abundance. I use that term all the time, but it's the Democrats who've created the scarcity, ideologically driven, especially the climate agenda. And you've got to confront it. And I think structurally, it's very difficult for them to confront it because of the unions and the ideology of the activists. And there's no one that's really standing up to it.